All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have brought back Kurt Francom to do a part 2 of the problem with men and masculinity. We had a great response to this. There were about 1,200 comments in the last episode that we did on this, and there were several different themes that came up in response to what we were talking about. But first, Kurt, welcome back.
Hey, wow, part 2. You know, you said this would be a popular topic, and you were not kidding. It was just, I was fascinated to see the views tick up pretty quickly and the comments. And I tried to keep up at first with all the comments, but if we missed you, sorry. There's just a lot to read there. But yeah, I'm excited to see the response that, many people appreciated the perspective that, that we articulated things that they've been thinking for a while or not been able to articulate. And then there was others who said, I kind of see it differently, and that's okay too. I just appreciate that the conversation is happening.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and I think that's why it's a popular topic, because I don't think that these things are actually talked about very often in the church.
Yeah,
we kind of brush it aside, or we have these, hey, brethren, you need to double down, or
right,
but nothing really getting down into the roots of issues, I think, that men have in the church. Now, there were several responses that had themed responses from the last episode, and I wanted to cover a couple of those. But first, I want to ask you: did you recognize anything in those themes, and what is your reaction to the popularity of the episode and the responses to it?
Yeah, the one theme I saw coming up more and more, and I even put a comment that you pinned to the top there, and this is why maybe it doesn't get talked about enough, is this feeling of, if men wanted to change, they should just change, right? Like, speak up more or step up, or, are you willing to do what it takes? Sort of this motivational, or this as if people are pointing to the apathy of men. And this is actually, in the leading saints world, this is a theme I see come up a lot when it comes to leading people. Like, you see a lot of leaders default to, it's apathy. We have such a problem with apathy, right? If we could just motivate our people enough, that's the problem. Mm-hmm. But I often say never misunderstand an ability problem for a motivation problem. And that's where we typically default. If ministering isn't happening in our quorum, well, people are just lazy. When in reality, most of them have very busy jobs and lives, and they're very more motivated people, right? So it's not an apathy issue, or it's not a motivation issue. And oftentimes my response to that is, men just need permission to be men who don't need permission, right? Like, if we can just give them that permission. I know it's like, well, why do we need to give it to them? They should just take it. Well, just that there's so much resistance, just the culture they live in, and the fact they think, I can't think about me first, I've got to think about others, to the point where they just get drained, and then they think, well, there's just something wrong with me, or they sort of die inside or seclude themselves. And so it's not a motivational problem. It's a permission problem. And if they have a community that is encouraging them to be men, go for it. Yeah, this is you. Step into it. I think that's going to go a long way.
Well, if you don't get it, though, from the church, or you don't feel you get it from the church, or you don't feel you get it from culture, that permission, it seems to me that you kind of have to just give yourself the permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think you still want to have some type of autonomous control.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Of who you are.
Yeah. And that's where the ability problem comes. Most men, they don't know how to do that. So, okay, I hereby give myself permission. Well, what changed, right? And so that's where different resources and things, and having a community, this is where the church can come in, of offering them, a community of elders saying, hey, listen, we are focusing on your core desires, what makes you man, the masculinity within you, rather than, well, let's just get together and go over the recent General Conference talk. Again, that's great, and we can learn a lot from General Conference talks, but it often doesn't speak to or create this foundation of stepping into what God has already put in us.
Another theme that came up a lot was, because we did talk about this, but it's was we talked a lot about getting outside, getting to the outdoors, shooting guns, playing sports, all of these much more masculine traits and manifestations of activity, male activity. But I think that we were focusing on that because that seems to be what has decreased the most.
Right.
Right. It's not necessarily that's all there is to be a man.
Yeah.
And what you need to do. But there was a lot of response to that. It was kind of like, I don't like sports, or I don't like the outdoors. What does that mean? I have to do these things to be a man. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not a big hunter. I'm not a gun guy. I kind of like camping, but I'm not like looking forward to it, every weekend or the next spring break. I'm going to get the family out in that's just not me. I'm not the fisherman guy. But the point being is that we need to create a place where men can discover what is that thing, right? What does make your heart come alive? And if we don't begin to ask people that question or create a space, a container for men to sit in and assess that and talk to other men and like, well, what makes your heart come alive, right? And you know what? I guess that is true. That is something that I'm more passionate about, and sort of lean into that. I remember one comment in there. Someone said, "Oh, is this why I love fly fishing so much?" I'm like, yeah. Not only do you love fly fishing, but God put that in you to get you in the river to commune with Him. Like that's where you're going to find a deep spiritual growth as you do that. And there's also this related to that, this feeling that, men just need to, be obedient, get to work, just listen to what the God needs them to do or whatever, as if, taking me time to restart is sort of looked down upon. But the Savior Himself, He removed Himself from His disciples, from the people, to go commune with God in the wilderness. There were several instances of that, so He could return with strength, ready to do, continue on His mission, right? So again, the point being is that you don't have to be like the rough like hunter and the gun guy or whatever, but whatever it is, lean into it and at least take the time to process and take that to God. Like, what is it that you put in me that helps me connect with my masculinity, which in turn will connect me with God?
Yeah. And then there was another one that really speaks again to this idea of the permission that is, or the shift that we've had in our culture. And this came from both men and women, but it was something to the effect of this theme, which was something to the effect of, yeah, of course, this is great. Let's just go back to patriarchy. In other words, men are the problem in the first place, and now we have to change them and change toxic masculinity and all these things. And I think that men get this attack all the time from all angles. And here we are talking about suicide rates. We're talking about men that are desperate. We're talking about loneliness. We're talking about depression. We're talking about, men being in these silos and struggling. And yet that's the response. Right. Hey, there's something wrong with you anyway. You just want power, or that's concerning. It just reinforces the culture that we're in.
Yeah, no, I agree there. And this is why we need to keep talking about it, because it is a little bit complex, right? It's not about, I think some people got the impression that we were saying, yeah, just, let the man go camping, let him be with the boys. And, that's part of it. But I get that that's not the only answer, that the answer isn't just to have the elders quorum do more outdoorsy activities. Again, it may help and you may want to consider it, but it's a lot more complex than that. And, there's things on both ends of the spectrum, the toxic masculinity side of things, and then the other side, which I title as the passive toxicity of masculinity. Mm-hmm. Even being too passive can be toxic, just like being too aggressive can be toxic. So yeah, I'm just glad we continue to talk about it, and I've got some ideas maybe I can share at the end as far as, all right, if I was an elders quorum president, or if an elders quorum president was listening, these are some things to consider to take the next steps to actually help.
Now, you'd made a comment before, Kurt, that really is kind of I have a similar concept that I run through called DBR, and I'm not going to go into that right now. It has to do with the Word of God and a delegation almost. But you talk about a masculinity that needs to be originated elsewhere and brought to a man to be developed. In other words, you talk about how there needs to be a model, a mentor, right, for men, and that you need that time with that mentor or with those mentors or those examples, and that without the actual examples of the masculinity, you may struggle in being able to develop your own.
Yeah. Yeah. And John Eldridge, states this often, which I stated in the part 1 interview, that only masculinity can bestow masculinity. And so, bless the hearts of all those single moms out there who, maybe they married that deadbeat and he had his own wounds and struggles that, where he didn't show up with his masculinity for one reason or another. But to be aware that, like, the mom can't do it all on her own. Like, there needs to be male role models that step in for both the developing young men and the developing young women. And I interviewed, I'm going to forget his name now, I'm on the spot, but a BYU Idaho professor who studies a lot about this. And he pointed me towards a study that showed that young women will, their bodies will start into puberty earlier if they do not have a father figure in their life, as if their biology is saying, you need to find a protector, you need to find strength in your life. And so your body will develop those characteristics that will draw in a masculine figure to protect you, because you're going to need that. And so, again, it's so fascinating to see how our biology reacts to this, that the masculinity bestows masculinity, going back to the men context, that even in an elders quorum, maybe a return missionary, he's out of his home and he's sort of grappling with life, and have an older high priest sit down with him and walk him through his career, or just tell his story, or, that's a very beneficial context that brings their heart alive and helps them feel like, okay, this is what I need. I know the next steps. I feel like I have support here.
There's in our culture today, there's, in the West and in the US, there's this, I hear this often, especially with younger women, but it's I don't need a man. And so there's more of a push of, well, if I really want to be a mother and have a career, I can do all these things and I can do it on my own. And you just look at the stats and you see how many single mothers there are today as compared to 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's astonishing, the change, right? And again, sometimes that's from a woman's own choice. Sometimes it's a man's choice. Sometimes it's, there's a lot of different pressures and forces that bring us to that point. But that seems to me, in that idea of bestowing masculinity, like you said, that cultural shift of the family and moving away from a traditional type of a family is something that is going to break that chain of masculinity. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is societies need masculinity. And I know we're talking about ideals, and there's messiness in mortality and different circumstances and whatnot. And sometimes, that single mom just doesn't need to do her best. But again, for her to be aware of, like, okay, my children need a masculine role model, whether that's a partner of mine or elsewhere, that's important to do. But society, as we've learned in history, we need masculine men who go to war, unfortunately, right? That's a very important trait that those men give their life for. And again, we have women that are in the military and whatnot, but generally speaking, masculinity plays healthy masculinity especially, plays a crucial role in the healthy development of a society. And I know there's, I think generally speaking, the studies and research will bear that true.
Yeah, and it does. Those stats are definitely there. You brought up before the idea of going out into the wilderness. There, in the book that is Wild at Heart from John Eldridge, there's a quote he uses from Howard Mercy. And this is it. Quote, "The spiritual life cannot be made suburban." It's really interesting. It cannot be made suburban. It is always frontier. And we who live in it must accept and even rejoice that it remains untamed. You had brought up previously Jesus going to the wilderness. He had to go to the wilderness before he actually went out and started his ministry.
Yeah.
Right. Elijah goes out to the wilderness. John the Baptist is a wild man, which just means he's out in the wilderness. what does that mean to be out on the frontier as compared to being made suburban?
Yeah, well, I mean, biblically or scripturally, the temples were in the wilderness. They were the mountains, right? Like there's something about returning to what is the most real that connects and grounds us in a way that we need to be grounded before we can take on whatever dragon is before us, right? And so, I mean, it's exactly the same model of why we have temples and our temple worship. And again, we don't necessarily use mountains anymore. But often we try and put them up on a mountainside. But there's something grounding about going to what is most real, right? And when you go to the temple, you experience a story of the beginning, which is the most grounding and the most real experience. So that's where the recharge happens, right? It's not going to be found in specific nuances of life, like good dieting and, hitting the gym and whatnot. Again, those things are important, but there's something about resetting and going to the core that allows us the strength to face whatever, life is put in front of us.
Well, and I think, again, it's something that's untamed. And there is that idea that the man is, you got the Beauty and the Beast, right?
Yeah.
where the man is a beast, but he needs to be tamed a little bit by the woman. And I think that's true. But there's something about the spirit of a man that goes out and that it's the exploration, it's the adventure, it's the passion, it's finding new things and taming them yourself if necessary out in that wilderness without opposition.
Yeah.
I just really, the idea of, because we are more and more a suburban nation today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That maybe, I don't know. There's a little bit of that. Where is that frontier spirit, at least in our spirituality, in our masculinity, and can we find that in the church?
Yeah. Yeah. If you to look really close at my palms, Greg, you're not going to find too many calluses here, right? But 2 years ago, we moved in a new home, and my neighbor next door wanted to build a fence, and so he helped me with that side of the fence, and then I worked on the other two sides of the fence by myself. And I remember just being out there, like digging the hole and putting the post in and figuring out the cement. Like there was something, like when I got done with that fence, I looked at it like, man, I did that. It sort of brought me alive because it got back to that part of me that shouldn't be tamed, right? Yeah. That the monster inside of me that's like, I feel good when I was out there doing something with my hands and building those calluses. And there's something eternal about that.
Yeah, that's cool. I've got a friend. He's a very influential evangelical Christian, and he talks about something that's kind of happening in society today. That's where he's got these we'll call them titles for men and for women, and there's the noble man. And there's the virtuous woman. And that if there was adversity out there, if you were to write a script and say, how are we going to show an adversary who's going to take things down in society or in the church or anywhere else, how would you do that? What are they going to do? And well, they're going to go back to the fundamentals of breaking down men and women and identities and letting that splinter, right? So he talks about this, and he gives a number of different attributes to everyone. They're all the same attributes for men and for women. But his interpretation is that the man leads with truth and righteousness and wisdom. And then he tethers those things with grace and compassion. And that a woman leads with grace and compassion, but tethers them with wisdom, truth, and righteousness. And so what he sees is that we've moved more into a culture of what he calls malevolent compassion, where compassion has gone untethered now. And men are falling into the same thing of they're leading with compassion. And it's a hard thing, right? Because I usually call it misplaced compassion, but compassion is not always good if it's not applied right.
Right.
And yet everything sometimes in our family lives, in our church life, in our in our institutions is based off of this lead of compassion. And I'll give you just a quick example. If someone is doing something that's not right, but you want to affirm what they're doing and make them feel good about themselves, then, you could see that as compassion, right? It's like I'm offering them compassion. But in reality, it's misplaced, because if they're doing something wrong, if you really care about their long-term well-being, then how compassionate is that really, right? And so he calls it malevolent compassion. Do you think men, and this is something women usually fall into, so you look at these ideologies today, a lot of they're led and adopted by a lot more women than they are men, because they lead with compassion. Are men falling into this kind of same thing? Do you see that at all?
Sort of this, isn't it like a Maxwellism? Like any gospel principle taken to extreme can grow wild or something. I'm overly misstating it, but I mean, that's again why the masculine and the feminine is so needed at times of, depending on the situation and the time that, that compassion is needed. And other times, I really need a coach that's going to look at me in the eyes and say, I love you, but this has got to change. Like you're walking down a path that leads to destruction. And I need to offer you strength in this moment so that you're aware of that. Right. And that's the confusion of it, right? Going back to the overly passive figure, as I framed as like the Mr. Rogers model, right? That if we stay there, like, and this is the thing that, everybody thought I was like trashing on Mr. Rogers. I love Mr. Rogers again, right? Like I want to reiterate that so well. Like he was a masculine individual. Fred Rogers, the person standing, facing Congress and saving his mission to help children, the things he did with race relations, incredible, right? But the character he played, that was for children, and it was very effective. It helped me grow.
There it is, yes.
Right? And so, and that was very necessary for Mr. Rogers to be very compassionate. And if you're called on to sub in nursery or in primary, like you take every part of that Mr. Rogers persona and you show up with that compassion and, over passivity, whatever. But when we take it to church or to the office or to our homes at all times, like that's where the problem is, right? And so, recognizing that, and in some spaces that masculinity is, it's desperately needed.
Yeah. Now, I want to go back again to what you talk about with motivation and apathy, because I think you can easily say that it seems sometimes to be a result in our society, right? I mean, there's distractions. You're off with video games or some consuming entertainment or pornography or all of these different things. Those are all, I would say those are all symptoms of some type of apathy, right? But you're saying underneath that, there is more an issue of connection, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
In other words, to solve that problem, it's not a matter of saying, as you say, speak up, step up. Are you willing to do what's required? There's something beyond that. And yet we fall into those same traps of repeating kind of these memes to men of just, double down. Right. But you're saying underneath that, there's a connection problem. What do we do to solve the connection problem then?
Yeah. Well, first we recognize that they've been baited. You look at, the weekend warrior softball tournament guy, or which is fine in moderation, the video games, which again is fine in moderation, but when it becomes an obsession, they've been baited into the wrong battle. Right. And we talked about every man needs a battle to fight. Right. Well, yeah, they're fighting the battle, but it's in this virtual world that the consequences don't matter. It's not real. Right. And so recognizing that, again, these natural desires, as we see in all sin, right, they typically go down the road of least resistance, where, well, this is what was offered to me. Like nobody else offered me a battle worth fighting for, but at least it feels like I'm doing it here, right? And so that's where the connection can sort of jumpstart the system of when I interact with a real man who's alive, that helps me realize, oh, wait a minute, like there's something going on here in this individual's life that I want to know more about, because I would love that in my own life, right? And then again, you may find, well, they go fishing a lot. Like, well, does that mean I have to like fishing? No, it means that you need to determine what that thing is, and you can find that through the connection of with other men.
And those things all seem to be they're like you said, they're virtual. I mean, you're living somebody else's life almost. And even I would look at the battles happening on Twitter, like, oh man, I sure gave it to that guy. Like, well, congratulations. Like, you're such a warrior of how you, someone was wrong on the internet and you made him look stupid. Like, it's so fake. Like, there's nothing real there, right? But it feels like, I think I'm changing some minds. Like, no, you're not. It's all fake. It's all and all the other things where there is type of that. It feels like there's men are looking for that battle and purpose, but they're finding counterfeit battles, right? That they can go out and fight instead of reality. And it's kind of like drugs also, right? I'm looking for a certain high, a certain feeling outside of sobriety instead of living in reality and finding those wins and that, with that richness and joy and purpose that you get inside of reality. And here you go to pornography and you go to, excessive video games or your excessive sports. I mean, anything like that. You could be excessive in all these things, looking for these other battles that feed that intrinsic masculine desire, but they're not real, right? So it's no wonder we're losing connection.
Right.
All these things are outside of us.
Yeah, it feels like it's feeding us, but it's really numbing us. I mean, and the father of counterfeit, right? Like porn, there's nothing more counterfeit about sex and love and having a beauty to love. That's so counterfeit, right? And hyper focusing on sports. I mean, you could go so far into sports that it feels like a battle. Like I'm in it with my team. We won last week, or did you see how our defense did? Like, wait a minute, are you on the team, right? Like, and again, I say those things too, but there's this feeling of I'm in a battle. Like, no, you're just watching ESPN highlights again, which is great. But if that's where you're finding and manifesting and feeding the desire for battle, you're actually numbing it, unless you're actually, going out and having real life, a real battle there. And that's where most men think, well, I can't do that. Well, why can't you do that? Essentially, they don't have permission, right? Never, whether it's their wife or their community or culture.
Yeah, and the ESPN highlights and things like that are great. But if it's replacing, again, reality, if it's replacing your own actual battles and adversity and overcoming those things, then you're living a counterfeit life, right? Your masculinity to some degree is counterfeit.
Yeah.
In that way as well.
Yeah.
You've got a masculinity spectrum that you've shown here, where you have on one end passive masculinity where there's low emotion. And I'm just going to read a few of these off here. You're closed off, you're hyper obedient. That's interesting. You give too much of self, you avoid risk, emotionless, opposer, love that word, one of my favorite words, clingy to wife and family, life trials, you're secluded, right? So that's over on this one side, and it's low emotion, passive masculinity. Now you go to the opposite end of your spectrum, and it's toxic masculinity, which you also have as low emotion.
That's right. That's what the main thing I want to show it in a spectrum, that we default. It's easy to sort of, demonize the toxic masculinity, the hyper masculinity. But both ends of this spectrum, we have to find that medium, because both ends are low emotion, low connection. They're just manifested in different ways.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of the it's kind of the Mr. Rogers on one end, right? Yeah. All the time, Mr. Rogers on one end, and maybe the pirate on the other.
Yeah, exactly.
Or and both are disconnected.
Right.
to some
Because
degree,
you
right?
may ask somebody, someone with passive masculinity, oh, how are you today? Oh, I'm fine. Like, how's life? How's your kids? Oh, they're good. Right.
Yeah.
On the other side, you may find ask the same question to someone who's has toxic masculinity or hyper masculinity, and they'll be repulsive. Like, hey, don't ask me that. Get away from me. I'm fine. I don't need help. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, is we can fall in this trap of this passive masculinity and feel like, oh, I'm just, I don't want to cause any problems. I'm just being a good church boy. When in reality, we're just as toxic as the hyper masculinity, and it's not healthy.
That's my favorite point you've ever made right there. It really is. That is my favorite point. That is excellent. It's not just one-sided, right? If you're moving off onto these ends of the spectrum, if you're too nice and you're too Mr. Rogers and you're too passive, that is toxic.
Yeah.
And it's not just toxic for you, it's toxic for those around you.
Absolutely.
Right. You're not asserting yourself, and you're not being real. You're not being, it's a way to continue to seclude yourself into that silo.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And confession time. I mean, I struggle with the nice guy syndrome. I struggle being too passive, right? I want to show up and I want to be everything for everybody, especially, back when I was bishop, I didn't want anybody to hate me. So let's just adjust. And some conflict is arising in the ward. Hey guys, let's just, chill out and let's just pretend this didn't happen. Right. Like, I struggle with this a lot when I'm trying to apologize too much for things, just even in the airport, I'm sitting on the window seat and I'm so scared to tell the person next to me, hey, I got to go to use the restroom. Can you get up? Right. Like, or I'm so sorry. Were you reading your book? Were you sleeping? I'm so right. Like, so I practice a lot. Like, I remind myself, hey, you know what? I'm gonna ask. I was visiting a family up in Boise the other day, and was staying in sort of a connected casita house behind their house, and they had me come in the kitchen. It's like, the kitchen's open, eat anything you want. And now naturally I'm like, I'm not gonna just eat anything I want. And so I thought, hey, this is a good time to practice. I walked over to the fridge, I opened it up, I grabbed a loaf of bread, and I started making myself a sandwich. And inside I'm screaming because I'm like, this is so uncomfortable. I mean, I'm but they offered, just take it. If somebody asks you if you want a glass of water, yeah, sure, I'd love a glass of water, right? Like, and so I am a recovering nice guy. And so I realize that this is difficult, and I'm still practicing, right?
Yeah.
I still fall short with it, but I've realized that I can't go too far that way, because I become just as fake as the other side of the spectrum with the hyper masculinity, right?
Well, just make sure you keep following the 12 steps.
That's right. That's right. So
now in the center here, then on this spectrum, you've got healthy masculinity with high emotion. Now, first off, a lot of guys are going to say, wait a minute, high emotion, hold on.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. But let me read these points that you've got underneath here. You've got connects with emotions. Whoa, wait a minute here. Cries, holy cow. Kurt, what are you talking about here? That's not afraid of conflict. See, that's a big one to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important. Find strength through other men, offers strength. That's crucial. Emotionally available, and life trials. I don't quite understand what you're saying. Life trials reaches out to other men. I'm not sure what you mean by that.
When you're having a tough day,
reach out to men when you have life trials.
You reach out, right?
Yeah.
Like, and this is crucial in the recovery aspect of addicts entering recovery. A big thing is you got to reach out to other men, right? Well, that's not just for the stigmatized labels of being an addict. Like, even myself, when I'm having a tough day, I've taken on some tough news, or I've lost my job, or whatever it is, it's important for me to pick up the phone and call men, right? Oftentimes we take it to our marriage. And, for example, I have a good friend who recently lost his job. Well, if he's struggling with that and he takes it to his wife to be like, hey, I'm really struggling with it. Well, she's struggling too. And it just can turn into a mess, right? But if I take it to another masculine party and be like, it's just been so tough today, right? And I've experienced this. I often call my friend Steve, and he's a recovering addict. And so he's taught me some of these principles. And I often, start the phone call like, okay, Steve, I'm doing that thing where I reach out, but today's been tough. I just need to talk it through with somebody. Right. And it's not like he has all the answers, but just this process of talking through really gives me strength. And then I can return to my family, with strength. Like, hey guys, we're going to make it through this. We're going to figure it out, or whatever it is. And so, yeah, I want to show this middle part of the spectrum, just because people often, they were thinking I was saying that, oh, don't be like Mr. Rogers. So you're saying to be toxic masculinity or hyper masculine? No, there's a happy medium here. And it's important for us to see the edges, the ends of the spectrum, that these are both toxic. It's the middle, right? And this is our good signs of asking, have you ever cried in front of people, right? And I think in our church, there's many opportunities to cry in front of people. When there's conflict, right? If the waiter brings you the wrong plate of food, or the steak isn't cooked right or whatnot, do you say, hey, listen to this, can you take this back? Again, you don't got to be a jerk about it. Like, hey, we weren't overly satisfied with what went on with our meal today, and we talk about it for a minute, right? Like, kind of leaning into that conflict is incredibly healthy. And again, it takes practice, but you got to practice these things.
Yeah. In the last episode, we went over something that was a question that I do think applies to every man. And it is, do I have what it takes?
Yep.
Right. And I think every man struggles with that to some degree, because there's a feeling in, as a man with masculinity, of having to, what is it? It's of having to stay above water.
Yeah.
Right. It's like you have to stay above water, and sometimes we just tread through it at times, and all we can do is tread water, but we're asking ourselves, do I have what it takes? So oftentimes it's kind of like, can I do what Dad did? Right. Can I be the guy and deal with this? I think that question is necessary always, and I think a lot of times what we're doing is we're trying to push that question away.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, I don't want to work. I don't want that question, because then I have to answer it. And that answer might be, I need to improve.
Right.
That answer might be, I need to develop some more strength so that I can do this. And that my answer might be, I might have to fail several times to be able to get where I need to be on this. And that's not easy, right? That's not an easy thing to do. But do you see that also, or do you feel that is a necessary question that we need to ask? I think it's intrinsic, but.
Yeah, I think there's no way around it. And when we attempt to avoid that question, we have no other choice but to numb, right? And that's that is the what's created the epidemic of pornography, especially among men. Like, I don't know how to cope with this feeling of I don't have what it takes, so I need this feeling to go away, and therefore I will act out. I will numb through through pornography, or whatever it be, video games, social media, pick your poison. It's the only reason that men would do that is to numb that question, right? But it is in leaning into that question of saying, there's this call for me. I talked to, I don't know if I mentioned this on the last one, but I talked to a 41-year-old man a few years ago who said, as in our conversation, I've had this nagging feeling that I need to go to law school. I'm like, you should probably lean into that. So there's typically this higher call, right? I talked about it in the context of the larger story, this call from a distance, inviting you to step into something very difficult. And you're right, you may mess up. You may make a lot of mistakes, or you may find that you're questioning yourself, but it's an act of, and talk about faith, taking those steps of faith into a larger story, whether it's law school or changing jobs, or showing up for your family in different ways, that you'll begin to find that you do have the answer to that question, and it can only come from God. If we take that question anywhere else, to our wives, to our jobs, I'm going to hit those sales numbers every quarter this year, and I'll prove that I have what it takes. Well, you're going to find that that's empty at the end of that road, right? You can only take it to God, where He's the only source of strength. for the masculine strength. He's the only source. And if we take that question anywhere else, it's going to lead us to only numbing out those things. Anyways, I feel like I'm all over the place with that. But
no, that's very precise, actually. I thought that was great.
Oh, good.
Again, that's kind of interesting about the idea of that chain of masculinity. Right. You're saying the source of that is our Heavenly Father, right? Or that source is Jesus Christ. That source is deity. That's where it ultimately is going to come from.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you spend the first 20 years of our life going to our mortal father to answer those questions, right? Like, you want to just perform on the basketball court, or you want to get the job, you want to go to school. Hey, Dad, am I good enough yet? Right? And then we spend the next 20 or 30 or 50 years taking the question to our wives, taking the question to our work, to our church. I mean, I'll tell you what, when I got called as bishop, I felt like somebody answered my question, and it wasn't God. God was calling me to that role, but finally I had arrived. Like, I was good enough, right? And I remember telling my parents that with this feeling of, I'm good enough, right? Mom and Dad, am I good enough, right? But I was taking that question in the wrong place. God already knew I was good enough, and he was willing to bestow that regardless of my calling.
So here's a comment that was also common. And I think that this is why these types of topics do so well. The comment is, I heard 10 seconds of this. This is from the last episode, and immediately felt heard for the first time in a long time. Right? Why is that? I understand that that's where culture has gone and nobody talks about these things, but shouldn't we be doing this in the church? Shouldn't we have these discussions in the church? Shouldn't elders quorum now and young men's programs be involving this idea of an adventure and a battle and a beauty and connection? It's not talked about. It's not done. There's no communication on this. What do we do in elders quorum or a young men's program?
Yeah, and again, I don't think it's a motivation problem. It's an ability problem. Most leaders, most communities, they simply don't know how to have the conversation about this. So that's why us modeling these things and talking about it, whether we're right or wrong, hopefully it's perpetuating that conversation. I mean, it would be beneficial for a group of in a local area to get together and watch these conversations or have them listen to it and then come together and talk about it. Right. And so yeah, absolutely. Should we be doing more in the church? Yeah, sure. Should we be doing more at home? Yeah. I mean, our communities. Yeah. But it's just a matter of understanding how to articulate these things. I think if we keep prodding that, I think we'll be headed in the right path. So
I kind of, as you're saying that, I kind of think of the communication among men is not very good usually. And I think to some degree, maybe we don't want to show faults. Maybe there's a place there where we don't want to be too vulnerable among other men, and show our faults. But in a way, it's just kind of like a white sepulcher, right? That we're putting up. With women, I think they deal with that a little bit more. Like maybe it's social media, and it's, hey, here's my perfect family and everything good that's happening in my life, and everything's wonderful. There are no problems with me, right? And with men, we just kind of be quiet. We don't say anything about it, and because we don't want to put ourselves out there at all. I just wonder, is elders quorum an appropriate place? Maybe it is. Maybe it's, I don't know, but is that an appropriate place to start sharing more about things, sharing more about, because I've got a couple of friends. My dad passed away a couple of years ago. He was always my go-to in talking about problems. But, a lot of people don't have that father, or a lot of people don't have those couple friends that they feel like maybe they can really count on and share something with. Is elders quorum the right place? Is that a place we can do that?
My short answer is absolutely. In fact, it is crucial that we figure out how to do that. Actually, just heard a couple of days ago, a friend of mine, I met him through just the Leading Saints audience. He's just recently released bishop. He's called recently as, and he lives outside of Utah, recently called as the Elders Quorum instructor. And he thought, for this first lesson, I'm going to just take a straw poll here in the room. He says there's about 10 elders in his Elders Quorum. And he said, all right, we're going to have you just write on this board I forget how he collected the responses, but they were anonymous, nonetheless. And he said, "Why don't we just rate how you're doing in life right now?" And one is, I'm doing incredible. Life is great. Awesome. Couldn't be better. And a 5 is like, I should probably be, sent to the psych ward. I am really struggling. And he said, he took those responses. Thankfully, there were no 5s, but there were also no 1s and 2s. They were all 3s and 4s. And he said it led to this remarkable, real conversation among this elders quorum about how we see each other every week, but they don't really know them, right? And how they could change that and get to know each other. And it just, the revelation of that, quote unquote counsel kicked in, right? And so if we could stimulate that kind of conversation, and it could be simply taking that straw poll of like, if you didn't know, that if you were anonymous, how would you respond? Now, if you would ask everybody by the raise of hands, who's doing okay in here? Everybody, maybe most would raise their hands, right? But to create a scenario where they can sort of really speak up and say, things aren't going as well as I'd like it to go, right? And so again, Elders Quorum, absolutely. We have the engine. We have the structure. It is beautiful. I love the inspired gospel in this part of it. We just don't know how to turn the engine on. And it's not a motivation problem. It's an ability problem. But we need to lean into it. We need to take the time to figure it out.
From time to time, I've run a couple of businesses, and I've been a part of these, what do they call them? Master groups. It's where you've got a few individuals that have success, and they get together and they talk about the issues that their businesses are facing, and they talk about this and bring it out with others. And it's incredibly beneficial if you're running a business, because these people have been through these problems before, or they've had a similar problem. You can find out what they've done. And this networking is really, it's like a master class, right? That you go to and sit down and talk to all these people that have been through these issues. Wouldn't it be great if Elders Quorum was that?
Yeah.
But like a master class on spirituality and life and the gospel and its principles, and being able to, and I suppose to some degree that's the way it's set up, but I don't know that we really share as much about overcoming problems for each other and how to improve our lives and how to be better men.
Yeah. And many, who've sat through Elders Quorum might be thinking, it might be noticing the resistance they feel in an Elders Quorum setting. And I had a remarkable therapist that I interviewed once tell me that there's no such thing as resistance, only lack of safety. And so if there's any resistance in an Elders Quorum or any group of people, it's not because they're just resistant or they don't want to share. You haven't developed the culture of safety enough for them to open up. And that example of that Elders Quorum instructor is a good example of that he created a scenario that there was enough safety for those men to say, yeah, I'm not doing okay. And then that led to a deeper conversation. Right. And so, it needs to happen.
Now we're going to end with this, unless you've got something else to add, but you've got a few points here on what an Elders Quorum can do right away.
That's right.
Do you have that with you right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd love to go
through
through
it. Cover those points.
Yeah. And we've alluded to these throughout, or at least some of them throughout our discussion. But I said last time, as if I was an Elders Quorum president, I would walk into my bishop's office and fight for more budget. There's no reason the Relief Society sisters should get more money than you get, right? And if there is a reason, well, let's have that discussion, right? And if there's inspiration that needs to go more towards one than the other, let's have that discussion. But there's simply not enough funds for the Elders Quorum president to work with. And again, not that it's pivotal, but that's a good one thing you could do. Another thing is guest speakers. Now, this again creates a lot of safety. We can walk into an Elders Quorum and say, you know what? we just need to be more authentic and more real in here. So let's do that from here on out. And you're going to get a lot of people blinking at you like, are you kidding me? You think I'm just going to open my soul because you asked me to? And so what happens if you invite a third-party guest speaker in? So for example, every time I see my friend Chris and Autumn Bennett come to a Fifth Sunday or an Elders Quorum or a youth youth fireside, and they tell their story, which is Chris's story of recovery, he has a line of men at the end who are at the verge of tears, who are hugging him because finally somebody spoke their story, right? And if they see that, oh, this is a safe place for this individual to come in and start and share their story, maybe it's a safe place for me to do it. So you don't have to rely on you being the Elders Quorum president and you have to suddenly get vulnerable and talk about this and that. Bring somebody in who's a third party and model what authenticity looks like. And I promise it'll do remarkable things, fill the bishop's schedule up. People will talk differently in Elders Quorum the more you do that. Stimulate mentorship. We alluded to this, right? Like, especially since the combination of the high priest and the Elders Quorum. There are incredible mentors. Just hear their story. It's not like they need to tell you what to tell the older men need to tell the younger men what to do with their life. And, back in my days, but just hear their story. And it's remarkable to hear these men in their 60s and 70s talk about their struggles early on life. And it'll connect the men more in a way that they'll start opening up or pair them up with each other, right? And encourage them to share the stories and just that mentorship, stimulating that this is a place to find mentorship. Because again, masculinity bestows masculinity. Then finally, get out of the quorum room. Like, obviously you have your meeting every other week, and maybe over time you will just focus on the conference talk with more authentic, vulnerable conversation and whatnot. But retreats, outings, if you find that, maybe there are those gamers in the room, right? That, I don't know, whatever, insert popular, video game here, that they can get together and they can do this together. Or I love the movie nights. I don't know if I mentioned last time that, it's typical for movie theaters to do $5 Tuesdays. And so we'd go see those guy movies on a Tuesday and invite people, and the conversations we'd have in the parking lot were remarkable. And we're drawn to those epic stories that are in a lot of movies. Text threads. I'm in part of all sorts of group me, we call them band of brothers, right? Group me groups that someone shares a scripture, a quote this day. This morning I put in one of the groups a simple Instagram reel that really resonated with me and started conversation, right? And then all of this, it'll lead to better quorum meetings, right? If we create the connection and create the brotherhood outside of the quorum meeting, it will continue and be a crucial touch point within the quorum meeting.
All right. Great advice. So summing up here then, apart from the checklist here and things that can be done, answering the question, at least somewhat, of the title of the episode, which was The Problem with Men and Masculinity, we would say the problems are connection, finding the right battle, a real battle, a real adventure, focusing on the beauty in your life. Anything else? Giving yourself permission.
Yeah, I'd say giving men permission to be men who don't need permission is crucial. We've got to, once you give them sort of that runway to go with, the momentum will continue them down the road. Yeah.
All right, Kurt, really appreciate your time. Great stuff. Again,
thanks,
things
Greg.
that need to be talked about that aren't usually talked about, and we'll probably do it again.
Yeah, and I'll just insert, last time I plugged the men's retreat.
Yes, go ahead.
At the time of this recording, we're about to, in just a few days is when that men's retreat will happen, and we've had a huge response. I'm going to gather all the Cwic Show groupies together, and I'm going to send you a photo, Greg. It's been cool to see people respond to that, and so we will continue to. Those are a great way to sort of jumpstart the system. If you're just like, I get what you're saying, I don't know where to start, plan on coming to one of our men's retreats, and you can go to awarriorheart.com and find out when the next one is.
Awesome. Go do it. Appreciate your time, Kurt.
Thanks.